All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tori Nagash, and I serve as the Research Initiatives Manager at ACUHO-I, and I will also be the technical host for today's webinar. I'm excited to welcome you to this funded research grant webinar, Resident Assistance and Title IX, Barriers and Opportunities for Access to Support. The funded research grant program was created to support ACUHO-I's goal of cultivating knowledge resources for members. Since 2015, with the support of the ACUHO-I Foundation, the aim of this program has been to encourage scholars, students, and practitioners to conduct high-quality research in support of our research agenda areas. If you're interested in applying or learning more, you can find information about the funded research grant under the resources area of the ACUHO-I website. The 2025 funding cycle is closed, and this year's recipients will be announced in June. The next funding cycle will open in March of 2026. Finally, a few housekeeping notes. The live transcript feature is enabled, so you have access to subtitles if those are needed. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be added to the ACUHO-I YouTube channel following the conclusion of today's session. Feel free to use the chat box to post any questions you might have during the webinar, but these will be answered during the Q&A period at the end. I will now turn things over to our presenter, Dr. Beth Paris.
Thank you, Tori. I'm excited to be here to talk to you all today about my dissertation research, which focused on the intersection between resident assistance and Title IX, and how their perceptions, beliefs, and experiences with seeking help on campus have influenced their decision-making. So today's presentation is going to, of course, briefly summarize the funded research study and all of the details of what goes into dissertation research. But my goal today, because this is a group of practitioners, is to spend a little bit more time discussing the implications for practice that emerged from my data. And hopefully you could walk away from today's webinar with some ideas for how you can apply these results to your work as practitioners, and how you can identify new opportunities to improve your outreach and support for the RAs on your campus. All right. So as a practitioner who's come up through residence life and is now working in Title IX, I've had a lot of experiences responding to both incidents in the residence halls and working with students and staff who've been referred to this resource. And I often found it disheartening when I interacted with student staff who felt like maybe these resources weren't available to them, or for one reason or another, they felt like they needed to hide experiences they had with sexual violence because they didn't want their jobs to be affected by their involvement in an incident report, which left them like alone and unsupported on campus, and also still in the capacity to serve and support others experiencing these incidents. So when I began reviewing the literature for this phenomenon and trying to find out what we already know, I found a study that examined specifically RA's perceptions of Title IX focused in their role. So how did they feel about implementing their mandated reporting role, and how might that impact them doing their job? But as one throwaway demographic question, the researcher happened to collect personal experience with sexual violence, and specifically categories of Title IX prohibited conduct. And these results were disproportionately large, representing more than twice the average population of survivorship among college students. So this shocking statistic kind of inspired me to think about this group as potentially a unique population worthy of further research. To begin that study, I developed these 4 research questions just to kind of focus on this RA survivor population, thinking about how their dual responsibility as a responsible employee on campus receiving this kind of training, and also just existing on their campus as students, might impact their decision-making about seeking help if they experience Title IX prohibited conduct. So the first question was kind of just assessing that dual role. How did they perceive Title IX now that they have some training and background and experience, and also existing as students on their campus? For those who do identify as survivors of Title IX prohibited conduct, how do they experience and perceive their reporting options on campus, and how might those differences appear between that population and others who might not have that experience? The third question was, how do their perceptions of Title IX influence their help-seeking behaviors? So if they did have this experience, or they did have this training when they had an experience of prohibited conduct, Did they make any different decisions about reporting to campus resources or seeking help? And then finally, I used a critical pragmatist lens for my study, so I also wanted to look for any racial or gender differences that could explain unique populations or different concerns to address. Phase one of my study included a nationally representative sample of RAs who responded to a mixed method survey. And that survey collected both demographic data about their RA training and experience, their institution size and region, their beliefs and knowledge about Title IX, and their responses to hypothetical help-seeking questions. I also included kind of a screening question that allowed me to identify folks who self-disclosed experiences with Title IX prohibited conduct. So because all of the survey respondents who answered that question had also answered some hypothetical help-seeking questions before, I was able to kind of use that data from the screening question to answer some of my research questions, both from the survey data and ultimately from phase two of the study, which was with qualitative interviews with folks who opted into that process. When I solicited respondents, I certainly used the professional listservs available, including ACUHO-I and also ATIXA, the Title IX professional organization, to try to identify folks who had served in some kind of RA or similar capacity within the last 5 years at a federally funded institution in the United States. So this population seemed most likely to have had some kind of training related to the current federal rule for Title IX, and were also more likely to have RA experience in the current climate on campus. For phase two, those who completed that for the full survey and answered the screening question with an affirmative answer of a survivorship experience, those were invited to schedule an interview at their request. So obviously more folks were eligible than participated in the interviews, but we did get 6 participants. I selected a critical pragmatism epistemology for this study because of its strong alignment with scholar practitioner work. And that's who I am, and that's how I approach both my work and my research. So this framework requires both a critical examination of the distribution of power in social realities and attention to the practical implications of knowledge. Critical pragmatism also seemed a natural fit for this purpose, which was to examine access to civil rights protections for a vulnerable population. And the lens also particularly lended itself to my research question about racial and gender differences. The theoretical framework that I used, which I'll show on the next slide, was grounded in a broader general population of survivors of sexual violence, but it was used as a baseline to kind of compare the data I collected from the RA population. And this is that model, the where to turn model, which is depicted here. It describes the phases of decision-making that survivors move through as they identify, evaluate, and choose the options for help seeking that they feel will be most effective in helping them feel okay. So in the design of the survey, as well as the interview protocol for phase two, I focused primarily on this orange section of the first kind of 3 decision points within the model. So identifying, do I even need help? What are my options? What can I do about this? And then ultimately deciding, what will I do? What will I try? And how does that influence my feelings about feeling okay? So while I didn't necessarily prepare to discuss the later half of the portion of this model in terms of how they ultimately acted on that decision point or how it ultimately led to their feelings of feeling okay, a lot of the participants on the survey and in the detailed interviews ultimately shared some of that information as well. Okay, so I can't really talk about my study without giving you at least a little bit of the data. So for statistic nerds in the room, you'll probably appreciate this, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview, and then the rest of the time we'll spend talking about the implications for practice. Okay, so the survey participants helped a little bit by identifying their institution's region on their response. So I was able to confirm a nationally representative sample in phase one, which is really nice. You can kind of see that there are certain, obviously, bigger regions and more institutions represented that had a higher representation of participants, but someone from each region participated, so that was helpful. So of the 70 participants who opened the survey, only 44 of them completed all of the scored items. Of that 44, 15 actually answered the phase two screening question in the affirmative, so they identified as a survivor of some kind of sexual violence. And then 6 of those 15 opted to schedule and participate in a qualitative interview. And these are the 6. They are obviously anonymized, but their identities and the experiences they disclosed are reflected here. As you can see, pretty demographically diverse. They also shared pretty much the range of Title IX prohibited conduct experiences. While I began every conversation very clearly articulating that this focus was going to be on their experience and how their training helped them respond to their own experience of sexual violence, naturally, some of the participants talked about things they'd done to support students as well. But ultimately, everyone kind of got to the crux of their story, and also was able to speak to why they felt that Title IX was supposed to be a resource or support for them, even if I put my Title IX investigator hat on and could say, well, probably not. I don't know what your Title IX office would have done with this, but I'm still going to reflect that this is an experience you thought you should have had and a resource that you thought you should have used. It's a little overwhelming, but this is the map to describe the qualitative data I learned about RA help-seeking behavior from both the interviews and the survey. So as you can kind of see, the model is reflected in here in these kind of similar phrases and the phases of decision making, but there's a lot of really RA-specific themes that came out of the data. They identified several unique barriers for reporting and climate concerns across campus that ultimately affected how they made decisions about where to turn. So often for RAs, this meant considering which resources felt accessible to them and which resources felt too risky to reach out to. Additionally, the RAs discussed specific experiences that contribute to their assessment of what happened, and nearly all of the folks who participated in an interview referenced their training in terms of making a decision of, do I need help? Is this truly a Title IX related incident? They had that additional layer of training to quickly name that, perhaps more quickly than the general population would have done. And while some of these decision points were consistent with the model from the literature, some were very specific to RAs, such as experiences responding to incidents, perceived risk of exposure to Title IX prohibited conduct on the job, and then also the knowledge of potential outcomes from reports with their residents that they may have observed in part or in full. Okay, now for the statistics. So for research question 1, how do RAs perceive Title IX? I conducted a few analyses to kind of compare their policy knowledge, their responses that kind of measured their trust in the Title IX office as a resource, and also their self-disclosed experiences responding to incidents or filing reports on behalf of their students. But overall, these RA experiences, both on the job and just generally in knowledge of Title IX, didn't actually significantly correlate with their knowledge of the policy or their trust in Title IX. It was interesting to me also that when I collected sort of just a self-reported scale of how much do you know about Title IX, it didn't significantly correlate with their measured knowledge of Title IX. And there's a bit of assumption there in hoping and trusting that most institution policy matches the federal final rule. And the very important key components that I pulled out into that scored measure should hopefully have been reflected in all of their institutional policy, but I found it interesting that it didn't correlate significantly in either direction. For question 2, in terms of how RA survivors perceive their reporting options, I measured the trust measure between participants who identified affirmatively for that screening question and those who did not. So I was using the survey data to answer this question here. The survivors in this population did not demonstrate a significantly different perception of Title IX on that trust measure than non-survivors. And at first, when I looked at the descriptive statistics before actually comparing this with the statistical analysis, there was over a point in different scoring between the two groups. Because there's only 15 survivors in the group, it's probably a sample size issue that affected the power of the result, but did not result in statistical significance here. And I also gathered some qualitative data from the survey and interviews related to this question, with folks talking about using their supervisor sort of as a sounding board to make sure it seems appropriate, noting that relationships with supervisors affected their interest in filing a report, and also some perceptions about off-campus versus on-campus police and sort of thinking about what the outcomes of those resources could be. For question 3, we compared sort of their perceptions of each individual resource in their hypothetical disclosure scenario. So if you experienced one of these categories of Title IX prohibited conduct, would you report to Title IX, your residence life supervisor, campus police, or local off-campus police? There were no statistically significant differences between survivorship groups in their disclosures to Title IX, residence life, or off-campus law enforcement, but there was a significant difference in disclosures to campus-based police, with survivors significantly less likely to report a hypothetical incident to this resource. So we got a little bit of qualitative elaboration from the survey, but because reporting to Title IX was the focus of phase 2, there wasn't much detail to add to the explanation of the results here from the interviews. But in the survey, we had folks explain that, disclosing to a supervisor ultimately meant also a disclosure to Title IX, and they knew that because everyone had been trained as a mandated reporter, including their boss. Someone mentioned considering a career in higher education and a fear that going through that full process of reporting to a supervisor or reporting to Title IX might impact that goal for them. Someone else also stated that they tried reaching out to multiple sources first and stated that they knew they could have also just initiated their own outreach to Title IX, but at that point they felt that their cry for help had been diminished, so they weren't going to seek any additional support. For research question 4, this is a lot, but in short, for all of these analysis, there are no differences between groups by race or gender. There was one that kind of approached statistical significance with disclosures to residence life supervisors by race. So it was just shy of a statistically significant result, with 92% of the marginalized group reporting they would disclose to a supervisor, compared to only 58% of white participants. So that's something that future doc students on the call might want to study further. And now for the reason we're all here. What do we do about this? I can't promise that I have all of the answers, but I did identify a few themes from the data, and certainly walking into this study with the expectation that I want to learn some more too and do better by this work as a practitioner myself. These are the themes that I identified. The first I found was that RA survivors in this study identified this theme that I was thinking about when I designed it, but I didn't expect it to come through as clearly as it did. And that is that they feel particularly vulnerable and at risk for experiencing Title IX prohibited conduct because of their role. And additionally, they don't necessarily feel like that's being recognized or that they have clear avenues for support that are specific to them. So we already know, and this has obviously been in the literature for decades and decades, but there is an increased risk of sexual violence on campus settings. But these participants highlighted that, like, not only are we on a college campus, we're on a college campus all the time. We're high visibility. We're required to be here. We're required to have access to all of these people and be visible. And yes, we're employees. We have a role, but we're not particularly powerful staff in, the institutional hierarchy. So that doesn't necessarily bode well for us to identify what our resources are. They also share that, we know what's available. We're trained to give it to our students, but no one especially told us, your students, these are for you. And that's, I think, potentially concerning that they don't necessarily feel that way. So in terms of recommendations that you might want to consider for reducing their exposure and increasing your support, the first is to consider what happens after RAs are responding to a traumatic incident in their role. One of the things that I did in my capacity in residence life was I created a post-traumatic incident response protocol for supervisors on call to implement anytime they received the phone call of, here's what I'm dealing with. If it fits this category, these are the additional steps that supervisor on call is going to take to check in with those staff that night and also hand off the check-in to supervising staff the next day. A lot of times, I know it feels like we're running 24/7 to incident, and it might just feel like, hey, are you good? Pat on the back, don't forget to submit that report, and then off to the next incident for you as the supervisor. But I'd encourage you to think about how you can spend time even in that on-call relationship, or to tag in that direct manager the next day to assess how that RA is feeling, to ensure that they're okay to continue their shift. and to ensure that if they need referrals for resources or even some time away from the role, that they have access to those things. One of the most challenging parts of the role that came through in these respondents' statements is that managing the relationships between the RA and residents and other staff and supervisors is super difficult. That they feel the pressure of this constant requirement to be accessible or to respond to all needs all the time. And that's not only burning them out, but it also creates a significant opportunity for boundaries to be crossed. So the respondents in this study cited feeling confused about kind of receiving some of this inappropriate behavior from either residents that they're required to support or other staff in the building that they have to work with, and then feeling disempowered to either respond to or interrupt that behavior because it's their job to work with those people. So it's just something to be mindful. Finally, and I know this is a touchy subject for a lot of institutions and a lot of departments, is thinking about how incidents are reported and to ensure that RAs have private access to resources if they need them. I know those of us who use common softwares like Maxian or Simplicity, everyone and their cousin could get copied on an incident report if we really want them to, but I would encourage you to think about for Title IX specifically if you want them to. These are the most private and sensitive subjects for anyone, including residents. But for RAs who know when I click that button, my boss gets a copy, it might be a barrier for reporting that doesn't necessarily need to be there. So if you have internal reporting structures you can revisit, that's something I recommend. Or at minimum, contact your Title IX office and coordinate, making sure that student staff have private lines of reporting if needed that are outside of your department. The final recommendation for practice that came out of this, sorry, this is the second one. The second recommendation is that it seems unusual in this model, but the RA survivors who responded to the survey and participated in the interviews were more focused on the outcomes of their potential help seeking than sort of the immediate impact. So the where to turn model was very focused on, okay, if I get this help, will I feel okay? Will I get an immediate support that I need? But the RAs in this study were talking about, well, what will happen to the respondent? What will happen for me? What is the outcome? What is the end result of this process? And they were speaking to this more obviously from their experiences with previous incident outcomes that they may have seen or heard partially or in full and then been disappointed by. And also assessments about how serious the incident needed to be for them to decide they needed to involve one of these resources. So these instrumental decisions were likely influenced by not only their increased training and access to knowledge about the Title IX process, but also their more frequent exposure to its outcomes. So for this one, I recommend working with your Title IX office in partnership in developing training to increase their awareness of all of the options considered in Title IX. So when RAs are only seeing the beginning of the Title IX process or the brief interaction between a survivor and a responding police officer in the hall, their perceptions of the outcomes are skewed by that small window. Everyone that we work with in Title IX has concerns about where this is going and how this is going to go. Reporting parties in particular want to find out what happens to their report. And one of the things we can do for RAs in particular is provide that broader policy training so that they understand what the policy says and why. So they might be making these snap judgments about the efficacy of Title IX, but that's because they don't necessarily understand why the confidentiality and privacy of the process is important and why the complainant-led nature of the grievance process tends to make those outcomes seem a little bit opaque. Additionally, we've also learned through, this study and the participants shared that they don't necessarily understand all of the options available in Title IX. Everyone generally makes the assumption that a report equals an investigation, and that's the only option. But providing RAs with better awareness and understanding of the full process and all of the supportive measures available through Title IX can start to alleviate some of these assumptions and make sure that they know all of the outcomes available to them. The third theme that came out for implications for practice was that RAs across the survey and the interviews expressed really specific concerns about reputation and their overall perception of resources on campus like Title IX and police. They developed their own understanding of how those offices function through their impressions of training events, their students' feedback after being referred, or after their own experiences trying to seek help, either through supervisors or direct channels. And sometimes these reputations even preceded their time on staff, with those rumors circulating from RAs who've already left the institution and hearing about, oh, well, I know what happened to that RA a few years back who reported their incident, and it wasn't good. Factual or not, those reputations can leave an impact. So to assess and improve your climate, this is probably going to be the most tag team effort and recommendation here between your office and residence life and potentially your Title IX peers. But from my experience, the returning RAs, especially when you see them in training every year, they're generally the first to groan as they walk in the room. Um, and it's important to note for you as well as your Title IX team that annual training is required, and it's important that you have contact with this group, especially because they're generally the most frequent reporters on my campus, at least. There's actually no requirement in the federal rule as to what that training entails. There's a lot of discretion in terms of content and a lot of opportunity for you as an institution to decide what you think your staff needs to know. So I recommend using the time to both of your benefits. If you're speaking to returners who've had a year or two of experience responding to incidents, they might not need to spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes in a training reviewing how to write a report. But you can do some feedback groups or focus groups and ask them really important questions about what they're hearing on the ground floor, what kind of reputational concerns they have about Title IX or other help-seeking supports on campus, and what they think the office could do better. And then when training is over, consider how else you might want to include Title IX in the residential community throughout the year. Speaking as a member of a very small team, I know we've gotten a few requests from some RAs who really want to have us at their consent program at 9:30 p.m. We might not be able to do that. But if you do have, a particular week or so of campus programming where you might have offices rotate through the residence halls and be a tabling presence during business hours or catching students outside a dining hall, those are the opportunities that even a small team on Title IX side might take up to be more visible and accessible to the campus community. And I'd also encourage you to think about other folks in your department who aren't typically in this group of seeing Title IX staff every year, even though they probably have just as frequent exposure to students trying to seek help. On our campus, that's often assignment staff who are getting room change requests for insert explanation here, and generally that explanation can be pretty detailed. Sometimes our business operations team gets information on their contract cancellation request that represents a disclosure of Title IX incidents, and even some of your front desk staff who you might not think of as either a Title IX mandated reporter or potentially a Clery Campus Security Authority. They're getting that information, so it's important they know how to report it and refer it. I also identified a couple implications for future scholarship. So if there are future docs in the room, you're welcome to take any of these you'd like. But it's clear from the data that the RA's experience are unique. They're identifying new barriers, new concerns, new issues to think about in terms of training and creating access points for your policies. And while that's important, and we definitely like to think of our RAs as unique, I also strongly believe this is not unique to RAs. I suspect there are a lot of groups on campus who fall into this bucket of, not quite student, not quite staff, or folks who have had increased access to Title IX incidents or policy and may have unique perspectives to share with you. So with that, I'll thank you for joining us and remind us that even though the civil rights climate in today's country is a little frustrating and certainly feels out of most of our control, it's important to remember that we do have our hands on our processes. We can kind of assess and learn more about our reputations on campus, and we can work hard to build our relationships across those offices to do, our students and our student staff a better service.
The floor is open for questions. If anyone would like to unmute or put something in the chat box.
have a quick question. Thank you so much for this. This is really helpful, and I've thought about a couple things I can do with this information you've given so far, so I really appreciate it. Um, so I couldn't remember. I was taking a lot of notes, so I was like, oh, and I probably missed this. Do you know, what did you mention earlier about how Title IX office can work with our RAs? Was it just the like potentially giving that training so that they better understood, or was there something else after that that I missed?
I think there's a lot of opportunity for Title IX to work with RAs. My recommendation specifically for really the Title IX involvement would be to revisit your training. If you do have annual training between Title IX and your RA teams, which most folks do, and to really broaden the scope of that in recognition of the fact that these students are doing a lot of our work on campus. And that as students, they might need to get both of those messages. Here's what you do as an employee when someone discloses to you, but also remember that all of these resources are available to you as well. And I would recommend that we all retain that information because that's another misnomer in the Title IX sphere. Students, faculty, and staff have access to Title IX. It's just not very common that people think of it as a faculty or staff resource.
Thank you.
See a question from Kenzel. Through your research, were there specific institutions that I felt were good models in how either housing departments or Title IX offices supported RAs? Well, I didn't collect their institutions. I did want to make sure that folks felt that they could fully participate in both the survey and their responses. So I did not speak to or collect that data from participants. But hopefully, with all this information out there, we can all kind of make progress. I think it's so specific to the culture and climate of your campus that it would be hard to kind of define this is what the model should look like because every residence life department has a different climate, every Title IX office has a different reputation, and you really have to be responsive to what's happening on your campus in a given year. Any other questions? I mentioned the post-traumatic incident response plan. Do you have some best practices you found to include in a plan to support student staff? Yes. No matter what counseling degree you think you have, find the professional. And that's what I did when I was in residence life. I don't have a counseling background. I have an education background, but I knew that seeking the university counseling services support in this area would give me the most up-to-date research and information about what we can do to support staff. So I partnered with actually our sexual assault specialist in university counseling to kind of put that together.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.